Number 16 is a great example of why the predict the question strategy is so important on the writing section. But also why sometimes that strategy can be very difficult to use, right? It doesn't always work that we can predict the question easily. I think this is one of those cases. But it also goes to show why it's important to take full practice tests so that you can get in the habit of noticing what a question is actually asking you for and getting your brain on that right track so that you can more accurately use a rule or follow your instincts, whatever the situation may call for. So you got to practice using full tests like you've been doing. But, there are also places where, like using books like the study guides that I wrote where you can break it out and focus on one topic at a time. That can help you learn the path that your brain should be on when you do encounter certain types of questions. So my first instinct looking at something like this might be that D is probably right because it is the shortest choice, and we know that style on the SAT means we should prefer shorter choices. So if we don't see them testing a clear rule, we should probably just pick the shortest choice. So what are they maybe testing? It doesn't seem like pronouns matter. Doesn't really seem like it's about verb agreement or a list of things or really any punctuation. There's no punctuation in these choices. So we might think, okay, well, if there's no rule, then it's a style question, and I can trust my gut, and my gut says that D sounds fine, and it's the shortest choice, and yeah, maybe that's a good reason to pick it. But that's not the answer. It's a trap. And the reason is they are testing a rule. They've just done a very good job of hiding it. And so one thing that we want to get in the habit of is when we look for the rules, we need to look at the choices, but sometimes we also need to look at the sentence itself. So the choices don't tell me much. They just seem like longer and shorter versions of the same few words. But the sentence has a comma right next to the part that's underlined. It doesn't always mean anything, but it at least means I do need to think maybe this choice is testing punctuation in its own way. And the way that it usually does when the punctuation isn't in the choices is they're testing whether certain words turn sentences into fragments or run-on sentences. So if there's a comma there, we need to make sure that we're not using that comma to join two complete sentences that could exist on their own. So let's see what we have. The first part, the lion dance requires the strength, grace, and coordination of two dancers. That is a complete sentence. That could stand alone. Right? I could put a period right there, and that would be a complete grammatically correct sentence. Now let's try D, just because that's the thing we're talking about. Both are almost completely hidden by the elaborate bamboo and papier-mâché lion costume that they maneuver. That sounds to me like a complete sentence. It's kind of just a complete thought. Now, yes, the both is referring to something that came before it, but it's referring to it in a way where it still stands alone grammatically. So even though choice D is the shortest choice, it's going to create a run-on sentence. And that's a problem. So the comma here is not enough to join the two sentences together. We need something else. Now, there are lots of things that we could do. We could change the comma to a period. We could change it to a semicolon or a colon or a dash. We've got lots of options. Now, none of those options are choices, so that's a problem. Another option we have is to use what's called a conjunction. A word like and would do the job here as well, as we could leave the comma and then use the word and together a comma and a conjunction are enough to join two sentences together. But again, we don't have that option. So what are we going to do here? Well, if we practice, I know I say this in my study guide, if we practice, we might recognize that there is a pattern. There is a way that sometimes that we can fix run-on sentences by turning the second sentence, this part, into a clause, an incomplete idea. Sometimes it's called a dependent clause, and I sometimes just call it a fragment because it's easier, less grammatical sounding, right? It's a part of a sentence, a fragment. And one of the special ways in grammar to do this is to use a word like which. So, here, let me write it like this. To turn a sentence into a dependent clause, use which. Now there's a choice that has which. So that's awesome. There's also a choice that has the word them. Now them is a pronoun, and when we're talking about run-on sentences, pronouns are also kind of bad. They tend to make things that aren't sentences into sentences. So C is going to have the same problem as D. Even though it's a little bit longer, it's basically saying the same thing, and it's grammatically independent as a sentence. Now here's the trouble with this one, is which is not the only word that has this special power. It is by far the most common word. But there are also a few others, right? So we sometimes use words like who or whom. Now I know that you probably never use the word whom, but it's a real word with a real usage. And on the SAT, it's generally not right. Usually who is the one that we use when we have the choice. But we don't have the choice between the two here, thank God. Instead, we have the choice between whom and which. And that decision is actually really easy. The difference is that which is used for things and who and whom are used for people. So that's something that anyone could tell. We don't need to be, grammar nerds to know if we're talking about a thing or a person. So we're talking about dancers here. Dancers are people. So that means we should use whom, and that means that A is right. Whew. That's a crazy question. That's a lot of rules and weird kind of situations that we have to think about just for one question. But I promise you, if you practice and you start to notice these patterns, all of the things I just did are actually kind of easy. You'll see those things in many places, and you'll have to make these kinds of decisions again and again and again, and so this stuff won't seem as weird. But the reason it seems weird is, the right answer is also kind of weird sounding, right? So if we hadn't predicted the question at the start, if we had thought that maybe this was about style and not about grammar, we would have put our brain on the wrong track. If we know it's about style, then that means that we're just free to trust our instincts. And I don't think anybody's instincts would be to pick A here. I think that the right answer sounds so weird and wrong that no one who's just listening to the sound of the sentence is going to pick that answer. But if we get good at predicting the question, and we get our brain on the right track, the grammar track, suddenly the part that cares about how it sounds doesn't matter as much to us anymore, right? When we're on the grammar track, that means we're following rules. We're not listening necessarily to the sound of the sentence. And so if the rule says we have to pick a certain thing, we pick it, no matter how bad it sounds. Because a lot of times rules get broken when we talk. And so we get in the habit of hearing it wrong. And so that's why our instincts get messed up. So the rules always take precedence. In this case, we're thinking about rules about run-on sentences, things that only matter when we write sentences down anyway, not when we talk. And we're also thinking about rules with words that we just don't encounter very often. Whom is correct here only because we're talking about people. That's not something I think we would notice unless we put our brain on that track and started thinking along those lines. So it's really important, especially for these hard ones, to get good at predicting the question. It takes practice. But that little comma right there, right before that number 16, that comma tells you a lot. And it's the reason I get this choice right. So try to notice those things, and that'll help you get a better score.